And now, our next guest, Esi Edugyan, a Canadian-Ghanaian writer, the Yellow Prize winner in 2011, and wrote Washington Black in 2018. Her work is known as looking at immigrants' lifestyles in Black immigrants in a white society. She is from John Hopkins and has written or has taught literature, and she has different positions in the States, in Iceland, in Germany, in Hungary, in Finland, in Spain, and in Belgium, and there's a lot of countries. And she is also part of the roundtable for many international events, the Lazar Institute at Islington in Germany, and the International Festival of Budapest Book Festival, or the Barnard College in New York. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Esi Edugyan.
Ein bisschen. So thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm so delighted to be here, and not least because after 2 years, I get to spend some time outside of my house, out of my pajamas. No, I'm truly honored. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with my work, I'm a historical novelist, which means that I write fictional works that are set in both the deep and the more recent past. Now, if somebody had told me 20 years ago when I was starting out that I was going to be a historical novelist, I would have been horrified, honestly. Because for me at that time, historical fiction meant, bodices being torn and rides in dust-filled carriages and marriage plots between scheming families. It meant dashing soldiers and glorious balls at which people overate and then had to loosen the stays on their bodices. It meant, in the end, the crises of the European aristocracy with its obsessions with reputation and bloodline. It didn't occur to me then, as it obviously does now, that these were merely the trappings of history, the surface story. Historical fiction, which is to say historical literature, not the bodice rippers, is not a tired rehashing of the past. I'd even say that the focus of historical fiction is not even so much on history, but on the present moment. William Faulkner famously wrote in Requiem for a Nun, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." Historical fiction forces us to confront our present challenges through the lens of the past. We look at the issues at play in a story set deep in history, and we ask ourselves how much has changed, how far we've come, or how far we have failed to come. We ask ourselves what remains to be changed. Storytelling is as old as humanity and has always been one of the ways that we define and understand ourselves and each other. Some stories try to represent some settled version of a truth, and some are extravagant fictions, exaggerations meant to appeal to our feelings, dramas that we use to overturn or reinforce our settled beliefs. The power of stories lies in their ability to establish that life is less random than it could seem. Roles are clarified. Reasons are given for why things should be the way they are. Stories can be illuminating, but they can also be distortions, forcing people into roles and histories into verdicts that don't look anything like the truth. I'd like to speak to you today about the uses of storytelling. I'd like to talk about the historic and the ahistoric, and how they color the way that we understand each other's stories. Now, I suspect many of you have seen the television show Bridgerton. Perhaps some of you grew obsessed with, or are maybe a little bit terrified to admit that you grew obsessed with, whether Lady Bridgerton would get together with the Duke of Hastings, and who was Lady Whistledown, the scandalous writer of society papers, and will Colin Bridgerton and Penelope Featherington ever end up together? I myself don't watch it.
Not at all.
No, I'm kidding. But I bring it up because, for all of its many pleasures, Bridgerton perfectly illustrates, for me, some of the surprising dangers of telling an ahistorical story, even one meant to be something of a bodice ripper. Bridgerton appears to take place in an alternate universe, a version of the world in which racial difference has no meaning and society is wholly colorblind. It is, I suppose, a hopeful view of how history might have run its course. It seems that race as a historical fact will be ignored entirely. And at first, there was something kind of refreshing about that to me. A past in which Blackness was freed from the usual hardship, the usual servitude and pain that we often associate with Black histories. And I even thought this as the author of a novel that I'd spent years of my life writing about an enslaved 11-year-old boy seeking his freedom in the 19th century world. I was happy, even relieved, to immerse myself in what seemed like an egalitarian society in which race did not matter. But something was off. Lingering in the background of the show is the reality of the transatlantic slave trade. The breach of this fantasy by the actual fact of Black captivity began to skew this world into something that it had tried so hard not to be. The cultural critic Aja Romano put it like this: if Bridgerton is set in the real 1813, in an overtly racist society, then surely we must think about it differently, for there are consequences to its flippant handling of racial identity. The fantasy of this 1813 is still anchored in the reality of systemic prejudice. So, what gets lost in this glorious fantasy are the actual circumstances of Black people in Regency England. Circumstances that were obviously harsher and more dire than the frothy concoction of Bridgerton would have you believe. Of course, we assume that license has been taken, but I think that, particularly for young people, we do not always know how much. We've talked a lot these last few years about exceptional forgotten figures in an attempt to broaden the historical record. I myself have written a lot about marginalized histories. But to slap my own wrist for a minute, the potential danger with this is that it can begin to distort the view and cause us to lose sight of the everyday realities of the many. And the truth is that life for Black people in Regency England was radically different. There were somewhere between 10 to 20,000 Black people living in London during Jane Austen's time. The historian Vanessa Riley notes that in the face of growing hostility from white society, the Black community was forced to pool its own resources and devise strategies for its own protection and survival. Now, it might seem funny that a wonderful show like Bridgerton could be at all problematic. But what happens when we blur the line between things as they really happened and things as we wish they might have happened? Ahistorical stories clean up some of this mess. We watch Bridgerton and we don't think about how the very wealth on display is made possible because of the transatlantic slave trade. We don't think about how the great capitals of Europe were built on the wealth being brought back from the New World. Seen through this lens, it then becomes seemingly fair to ask, if people are the products of a society that has in some measure always been equal, why have some thrived and others struggled? It opens the story up to possibly becoming one about innate racial qualities rather than one of unequal opportunity. The through lines get shattered. It blunts the obvious fact that the racial disparities we now face in the diaspora are the result of centuries of rights withheld and freedoms denied. It puts the onus on those who, in fact, had no such agency over their destinies. I think we are living now in the great ahistoric age. From the bell curve theory, which suggests intelligence is tied to race, to the great replacement with its claims of white extinction, we find ourselves now in a time where people feel free to draw their own narrative through lines divorced from historical fact. Stories are powerful, and as illuminating as they can be, they can also powerfully distort. Stories are a central way we build our cultural myths. Part of their work is to establish context. They make clear what has gone before us and become repositories of our collective past, showing us how we've ended up where we are and reflecting our hopes and desires for the future. In Canada, where the population of people of African descent has never exceeded 3.5%, and in fact, in British Columbia, it's never exceeded 1%, Black stories have a marginal, ghostly quality in our collective imagination. This, despite the fact that all across Canada, Black people arrived through all means of force and desire and necessity and built lives on the land. Why does this matter? Very simply, because if we fail to acknowledge all of our multiple histories, we will fail to understand and confront the sources of our inequity. As Aja Romano said about Bridgerton, there are consequences to a flippant handling of racial identity. Our world is still anchored in the reality of systemic prejudice. Only with real historical awareness can we begin to understand what needs to change and how we might begin to change it. As a Black girl born in Calgary, one of the things that has always struck me is the way that our schools, at least in the 1980s, failed to fully teach African Canadian histories. There has been a Black presence in Canada since at least 1628. Olivier Le Jeune was probably not the first slave, nor the first Black man in New France, Quebec, but his is the first record we have of an enslaved Black person living in Canada, or what would become Canada. We know so little about his life. He was brought directly from Madagascar by the English, was sold in New France, ending up in the household of a farmer with 10 children. He eventually became a student of the Jesuit superior, Father Le Jeune, and when he was baptized, he took the man's name. He never learned to read, signing his name with a cross. He was eventually granted his liberty, though as he died at just 30 years old, his was a short-lived freedom. I mention him because to me, his story perfectly illustrates a failing that we Canadians can sometimes have when looking at our past. When we talk about slavery in Canada, what we are usually talking about is the Underground Railroad, about how Ontario was the final destination, the place of ultimate safety. And even that isn't something that was much discussed out west, where I was born and grew up. It was more of an Eastern story. Almost absent from the conversation is Canada's own engagement in slavery, its importation of indentured African labor, its trading of salted cod and other staples from the eastern provinces for rum and sugar from the West Indies. The historian Robin Winks estimates that there were likely close to 4,000 enslaved people in New France alone, including indigenous slaves. French settlers preferred what they called Panis, meaning indigenous people from the Pawnee tribes, but the English imported Africans, who were also called Panis, the tribal name now synonymous with the word slave. About half of the enslaved lived in or around Montreal, the rest in small towns beyond it. Because of this urbanization, few slaves worked in the fields or in mines, though some did. Black slaves were more often household domestics. The second wave of Black migration in Canada happened in 1782 with the arrival of the Loyalists to Nova Scotia. The Loyalists were those who'd fought alongside the British during the American Revolutionary War. The British offered emancipation to any enslaved person who'd help them win the war. As newly free people, many Blacks felt entitled to the same benefits the Crown was offering its white subjects. But when they arrived in Nova Scotia, they found themselves with far smaller plots of land and no provisions. In nearly every case, this land was located far from any amenities, and their communities were effectively segregated. Our ideas of pioneer life rarely seem to include the people of African descent who, both enslaved and free, built farms, homesteads, and roads, and who hunted and fished on the land and lived lives of spectacular diversity. Now, as I've said before, part of the work of stories is to create context, the context of inheritance, of ownership, of reclamation, but especially of belonging. To deny those on the margins their stories is to deny ourselves this greater context, which we use to make sense of the world we inhabit together, and why it now looks as it does. Because stories often rely on cultural touchstones, and because people can sometimes have warring agendas and refuse to agree on those touchstones, the silencing of stories can bury the reality of what was. A past that you don't speak about can powerfully shape the present. And so the thing that makes stories so urgent, their feeling of reaching across time, is what can make them uncomfortably revisionist. Certain people are cut from the narrative. Certain events go ignored. Certain histories are rewritten and distorted beyond all recognition. And the realities of today lose their context. So, what role does the historical and the ahistorical play in today's workplaces? In particular, how do they transform the idea of allyship and about what forms allyship might take, and about what intentionality can be brought to the project of real equity? Obviously, I'm just one person with one opinion, though an opinion that is forged in sometimes painful experience. For me, the answer lies in storytelling and in the rejection of the ahistorical. Practically speaking, I will break this down like this. 1, listen to the stories of others. True allyship means not just listening to each other's stories, but listening to each other's stories without trying to co-opt them or to subvert them. It means listening without othering. It means acknowledging difference without assuming what forms that difference might take. It means asking questions sensitively and with real interest, wishing to truly know the answers and not simply waiting to hear the expected. It means honoring each other's histories. 2, make no assumptions. One memory that came back to me while I was writing the Massey lectures last spring was an afternoon that I spent in Beijing, China, back in the beginning of the summer of 2013. I was walking through an outdoor market near Tiananmen Square with my guide, who was this sprightly American who spoke so quickly and with his hands. He was wonderful company. But I remember going through this market and passing stalls with, intricately folded steamed foods and metal gadgets and even iridescent beetles onto which rhinestones had been pasted so that they were like moving brooches. And I caught sight of a group of men who were similarly dressed, as if in uniform. They were small in stature, no taller than myself. Leaning over, my guide explained that they were farmers from the countryside. As the men passed by, all of us looked openly at each other. There was nothing challenging in our glances. They were looks of simple interest. Now, I recall, very clearly, one man's, deeply lined, sun-baked face. And I remember his sober, faded clothes, his black suit tidy and pressed, but threadbare. I pictured him laying out this suit the night before in anticipation of his journey, the prospect of the city's novelties tempered by his nervousness at finding himself so far from home. I recognized, too, something common between us. We were both at sea in a city that we neither of us lived in, carrying in our bodies and our clothes the mark of the foreign. Our alikeness felt stronger than any difference. But then I had to ask myself, was this actually true? I think in my desire to find an ally in that moment, I had projected onto the stranger my own uneasiness. Maybe everything I sensed in him reflected my own prejudices, based on romantic and simplified ideas about country life, and on my strong, sudden urge to feel understood. Maybe the man felt the opposite, in fact. Maybe he barely took note of my presence beyond my passing form, and maybe he felt absolutely nothing at all. Mine was an ahistoric impulse. In that moment, I found myself forming judgments as much from assumptions and guesses about the man's life and history, and even the history of people who shared his race, all of it taken completely out of context in the absence of hard fact. This was a natural but potentially dangerous thing. In my case, what I assumed about this man was not negative. But in another time, another place, it might have been. Faced with physical difference, we measure the assumed gulf of experience between ourselves and another, and we decide, if at all, we will allow it to matter. But in reality, a glance, even a conversation, rarely tells us everything about how it might matter. Listening is a long project, the work of years. How am I doing for time? Good? Okay. Okay. 3, strive for equity beyond symbolism. I woke the other morning to a story in the New York Times. A former Wells Fargo employee had gone public, alleging that the bank was holding fake interviews with women and people of color as a gesture towards appearing more equitable and diverse, all the while reserving the posts for white men. 8 employees affiliated with the bank also came forward and alleged that they'd been instructed to interview people of color and women for roles in the company that had already been filled. The employees claim that the idea was never to consider any of the aspiring employees for even future positions. It was simply a tactic to create false data and boost equity numbers. What is anyone to do with such a dismissal? I certainly don't know. It's depressing. It's an act that suggests, counter to what Faulkner wrote, that the past is past. The past is dead. It shares something in common, strangely, with a racial casting in Bridgerton. A desire to separate where we are now from where our society was then. History was awful, it seems to say, but let's not complicate the present with the wrongs of the past. The allegations against Wells Fargo are obviously an extreme example of the collapse of workplace diversity initiatives. It must be said. On a smaller scale, such collapse might present itself as the hiring of a single diverse candidate or hiring only enough candidates to shift equity numbers. It can feel very tokenizing to be the equity hire, which can have about it the whiff of not being as qualified. It strikes me, too, that diversity training should be mandatory for all institutions, it being, after all, only business speak for listening to and understanding each other's stories. 4, do not take up space meant for others. In my Massey lectures, I told the stories of several women, mostly academics, who weren't Black, but pretended for various reasons to be Black. They had written treatises on race and slavery, taken up prestigious posts in African studies departments, and become well-known activists. I'm sure you've all heard of the academics Rachel Dolezal and possibly even Jessica Krug. These were the focus of my essay, my piece. And I thought that they were really fascinating for so many reasons, obviously. But what was interesting to me was that though in many cases they were, amazing advocates for the Black community, the fact of their racial fraud overshadowed all of their amazing work that would have been just as powerful had they chosen to occupy the roles of white allies instead. I compared the stories of these women to the strange case of Clarence King, whose story was first discovered by the historian Martha A. Sandweiss. King was a famous surveyor at the turn of the 20th century, a scientist who came from a wealthy, well-established Rhode Island family. He lived a life of great privilege, attending Yale and Harvard, and counting among his friends some of the foremost thinkers of his day, including the novelist Henry James and James Weldon Johnson. Strangely, under the pseudonym James Todd, King would go on to marry a formerly enslaved woman and raise 5 children with her in Brooklyn. He told her that he was a light-skinned Black man born in the West Indies. His work as a porter often took him away for long stints, but his commitment to her and the children was unquestioned. And yet, on these so-called trips away from home, He was usually just across the city in Manhattan, fully immersed in his other world as a white man, taking up rooms at the Knickerbocker Club to drink with famous friends like Henry Adams. Now, whatever one has to say about his very, very strange racial fracturing, what remains fascinating about King is that he made his strongest arguments against racism, not from within his Black identity, but as a white man. He wrote about a future in which there, quote, were no more Irish or Germans, Negroes and English, but only Americans belonging to one defined race. I mention his story not because anyone here needs to be warned away from the dangers of racial fraud, but because, paradoxically, King's experience points the way towards what true allyship might look like. As a respected scientist whose opinions were highly sought after, he reached ears unused to such ideas. He relied not just on his social status, but also on his work as a thinker and a writer, using long arguments to explore ideas of racial reconciliation and drawing up short his colleagues who expressed racist opinions. As a white man, these were the roles available to him and where his advocacy was meant to end. Now, we can't know whether King felt that he was living out an authentic experience as a Black man. But as a white man, he was without a doubt living out an authentic experience as an ally. He called out prejudice in circles people like his wife had no access to, and he did this without exploiting her personal experiences or those of his children. The work of equality is not the labor of the few, but the many, including those who have benefited and continue to benefit the most from an unequal system. And everyone has their part to play. But it's important not to speak for or over others. In the end, storytelling is what will connect us. The Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski has suggested that when we meet a person who is racially or culturally different from ourselves, we are really meeting two people, though we may not always realize this. The first person is someone very much like us. He feels pain and pleasure, experiences successes and suffering. He shies from cold and hunger, and is delighted by good luck. He is as deeply rooted in his humanity as we are in ours. The second person, whose identity overlays the first, is more of a symbol. He has certain physical features informed by his genes, certain beliefs and convictions that reflect the culture in which he was raised. He presents as a kind of emissary of his race. When we meet a stranger, it is hard for us to separate these two beings. We're constantly negotiating this duality, the racialized person and the actual person, in a way that isn't fixed, but that shifts constantly, depending on the historical moment, on our preconceived ideas, and even something as fleeting as our mood. This double vision cuts both ways. We experience strangers as other, and we are othered in return. The stories we tell ourselves about each other also have this duality. They are about living, breathing people, but they can also be fantasies that largely reflect back on ourselves, betraying our own assumptions, our own hopes, our own hatreds, and our own fears. And so, in this way, every opportunity that we take to listen to each other, every time we open ourselves to the connections that stories can create, we actively free ourselves from our distortions. We allow others their true and genuine histories, free of assumptions. We give each other and ourselves the gift of an unfinished story. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you very much. I'll take some questions if anybody has any.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. My name is Steve Thend, local 378 from here in Vancouver. Just had a question. You touched on the history of Black people in Canada. Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned before in the past about the history in schools and how, like, I grew up in the 80s and 90s here in BC. I was born here in Abbotsford. But you mentioned that you were born in Calgary and the history of Black people in Canada was not taught in Canadian schools. And can you explain why that is? And how come we don't discuss that? Like, I mean, not many people have heard of Rosemary Brown, and I just learned about her maybe a month ago. And she was a strong Black woman who was the first female NDP, actually first female Black MLA who happens that she was an NDP MLA, and she held her seat for, I believe, 14 years. But how come we're not taught that in school, and only we have to pay money in post-secondary education to learn about that kind of stuff? Can you please elaborate? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I mean, I think as with anything, there's a line in my Massey lectures which was something like, I think the longest war being waged in the history of human ideas is this war over the supremacy of stories. And it's, the stories of the majority are the ones that tilt the axis. These are the ones that are obviously taught in schools. And I think, having mentioned that the population of African Canadians has never been greater than 3.5%, it's always been treated as this is a liminal history. This is something that maybe isn't even seen as being part of the broader fabric. And I think, as somebody who grew up in the West, who grew up in Calgary, that's the dangers of this is that people from those communities can start to feel disconnected or unmoored from, the greater, just completely disconnected from a sense of place, but also left asking themselves, where do they fit into the greater story of our nation, if this is something that we're never discussing. And it also maybe grants a kind of permission for those who aren't, who don't come from that particular community to see marginalized peoples as being, not quite of the fabric, like not quite there. I know I grew up with a sense of, we have a long history of migrations in this nation, but we tend to think about Black migration to Canada as being something that originated like in the 1970s with the advent of Pierre Trudeau. And that's just not, that's the narrative I grew up with. And it's obviously a distorted narrative. And I think I think it wasn't taught, if I can speak for Alberta schools, because there wasn't much in terms of, just in terms of representation of bodies. It's like, well, this is this 1% of the population. How is this a part of our history? For me, the big eye-opening moment was when I went to study and did my master's degree in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins University. And my partner concurrently had traveled down to the University of Virginia and was doing his degree in Charlottesville. And so every weekend, he would either drive up to Baltimore or I would go down to take the bus down to Charlottesville, which is another story in and of itself. It's a horror show to take the bus from Baltimore to Charlottesville. But I remember visiting the huge, just beautiful library on the University of Virginia campus. It's Thomas Jefferson's university, which he built on a mount. And then he built his home on a different, so he could sort of look across the valley and see the university that was his and that he had built. But I remember going into the library and going into the stacks just randomly and pulling out a history of Alberta, finding it, of all places, in Charlottesville, Virginia, and taking it out of the library and just, flipping it and being astonished to see photographs of Black settlers at the turn of the 20th century, settling, that's another issue, to use that word, but establishing communities in northern Alberta, the largest of which was Amber Valley. And I was completely just like blown away by this, couldn't believe it, that there had been a community of African descent who had existed in the province that I was from and had been there for, I guess it's a more, a deep history because my idea of migration was that it was something so recent. And to discover that this history existed was astonishing to me. And I began to ask myself why this community hadn't been something that we had studied in school, given that we had a sort of broad overview of Albertan settlement and the various communities, the Doukhobors, Ukrainians, Icelanders, everybody who had come and settled this area, but no mention whatsoever of those African American communities who'd come up from Oklahoma. And I really feel like, I guess, in 2020, that was the moment in which we really started to look at this omission and question it. But I don't really know that, I really don't know if this is going to have a lasting impact, or if that was a moment where people were open to discussion, and now the backlash has started, and especially in America, there's this discussion about critical race theory, and for, African diasporic histories would somehow fall under this idea of critical race theory, which is a shame, because, when we don't look at histories on the margins, I mean, these are our collective history. This is part of Canadian history. Why are we denying ourselves that knowledge and that awareness? It's really quite striking. And, I would love to see, I kind of keep in touch with a coterie of academics who are really, a coterie of teachers who are really looking to sort of change the curriculum. But I think it is, I think it is contentious, especially now in this period of the starting backlash, to try and get that, some kind of a historical I shudder to say the word restoration because that sounds like I'm being revisionist, but just this enlargement of history. It seems like it's an ongoing, very fraught battle. And I think it's because people are very married to their hardened ideas or their hardened stories about certain events in history. Despite the fact that history is a living thing. I mean, there's a whole branch that's the study of history, which is historiography, which is to study the ways in which the storytelling around historical events is constantly changing and evolving. And I think we just need to accept that on a grand scale and accept that all of our sort of settled histories aren't settled, that there can be these enlargements there can be an enlargement or wider discussion about the things that have been left out. So that was my very elaborate answer to your wonderful question. Do we have time for more questions? Are there any more questions? Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Okay. Hello, I'm Julie. I'm local 610, Region 1. You can notice by the accent. I know, because when I talk to somebody that's Anglophone, I like to speak English, but if you want, I can do both.
Oh, I can understand if you want to ask.
Vous comprenez le français, but actually, well, okay. I'm going to do half and half, like a lot of people in Quebec. Okay, so it's hard, of course, to speak after such an eloquent discourse. I'd like to go back, and this is the fun part. I like to have fun and less fun subjects. Like we talk about Bridgerton, you got my attention there, right? The Netflix series that most probably a lot of people saw, maybe not everybody. Bridgerton, it's une série sur Netflix où on voit le cas.
Where we see another program with 50%.
Que c'était un danger.
But she said it was dangerous because the context was false. We had a false impression. It was that this was happening 200 years ago. And
if I understand well, you have a level of discomfort with this theory. My question is, maybe because I'm an engineer, when exactly did that happen? Right at the beginning, or was that like a growing pain or something? And how much discomfort? And lastly, if you would put a warning on that Netflix series, sometimes you to be politically correct or historically realistic, what would you put in that warning? That's all.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So yes, this dissatisfaction with Bridgerton, which, I will admit, initially, I was so charmed by this because I am somebody who reads a lot of historical novels, and in particular, I'm a very big fan of Jane Austen and her Regency era novels. And so to see a kind of Black presence in that space was just formidable and so refreshing, and I really loved it. But there was a moment, maybe halfway through the first season, where there's some mention of the transatlantic slave trade, and you sort of are pulled up short then because you're thinking, oh, this is not a fantasy world that's entirely divorced from the realities of that era. So there is a transatlantic slave trade. So if that's the case, if this is not an entirely fantastical world that we're dealing with, how do we then reconcile these kind of vaunted aristocratic Black figures, of which there are many in the series, and of which there were not many in Regency England? The Queen you're mentioning, there is even some dispute over whether she actually was a Black woman. This is still something being talked about by historians. I think she was called, Charlotte, that's right. And I think they had a name like the mulatto queen, but it's still something that hasn't been wholly confirmed. But so you have all of these figures occupying this very rarefied space of the aristocracy, which is delightful, on a fantastical level, but it doesn't quite, it doesn't quite go with the whole idea of the transatlantic trade and all of this wealth that's being built up on the backs of, of the dark trade. And so because these things are seeking to coexist in this series, it almost, like the reality of the trade and the fact of that cannot work alongside the fantasy of an aristocracy in which everybody is seen as equal and that this is an egalitarian society. Well, no, it's not, because you've allowed this breach in. And so you start to think, okay, if people watching are understanding that the trade still did exist, are they also then processing the idea that there was a very extensive black aristocracy? Is that something that's kind of creeping in, despite the fact that on the surface, of course, that this is not what it was. But because you've introduced the fact of black slavery, you're sort of saying that this, to a certain degree, is historically accurate. So where does the historical inaccuracy start? And so that, to me, seemed a little bit, if I'm thinking of, like, my daughter, well, not that I would let her watch that show, but if I'm thinking, she's only 10, but if I had a teenager who was watching this show, and how much, I would maybe really be wondering if they're able to sort of negotiate what's real and what's fiction. In terms of putting a warning on the show, I don't know. Yeah, maybe I wouldn't say a warning, but maybe just something that would say that, to the effect that this is fantasy, this is not reality, in the way that we do with movies that are sort of like based on a true story. Maybe you could sort of say based very loosely on some, very, very loosely. But don't take this as fact, because in fact there was not this sort of amazing egalitarian society in which there were tons of black aristocrats who were rubbing shoulders with, it's just not the case. But thank you for your question. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you. Well, first of all, it was a very nice talk, so thank you for coming over, and we really enjoyed that. There was only one comment that I wanted to make about Bridgerton, since we are talking about that. The series is based on Julia Quinn's novels. Mm-hmm. So when Julia Quinn wrote all those novels, there was no racialized character in them. They were just all like white people novels. It was only when Netflix started to make a series, they created this fictionalized universe. So it's actually kind of ironic that they were trying to be like rationalized, and they were moving with the world and showing the world that it's based on equity. But in doing so, they created all those questions in our mind and your mind, that when we see the series, we actually start asking all those questions. So it is a fictionalized universe. There will obviously never be a Queen of England person of color. So I thought I should mention that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. It is one of it's a strange kind of outcome of sort of colorblind casting, that you do that kind of casting to create more roles for actors of color, and also to sort of just make Hollywood more egalitarian. We want to kind of show more faces on screen too that are diverse. But yeah, in the case of a historical piece, it can become contentious. That is sort of something that is, I guess, par for the course, and you kind of have to be careful with it. But I appreciate your comment. Thank you. Oh, sure. Okay. Any more questions? Oh, yes.
Just a quick one. I wanted to thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. I really appreciated it, especially when you were talking about not leaping ahead, about waiting for people to finish their stories because it may not go where you expect. That's something I hadn't thought about before, and I really appreciated that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. It's great. I told my wife that you were speaking, so I got to sneak her in as an observer because she's a big fan. But we had a question for you. Ama Asante made a film called Belle, which it explores the tension of a black woman raised by a free aristocratic family, including a judge presiding over a seminal anti-slavery case.
Yes, Lord Mansfield. Yeah. The greatest judge of his era.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the story of real people, but the question is, the movie still privileges an elite view. And so I'm just wondering, are such stories more valuable for inspiring allyship and shedding light on unusual stories of black people in history? Or is there a risk in focusing on where black people fit into a white world instead of creating their own?
That's an interesting story. And I mean, it's been a while since I've seen that movie. So in terms of point of view, but you're saying it sort of privileges the white
a more
perspective?
elite,
Right.
perspective.
Yeah, I wonder if that would be the case if the movie was made today. Like, it's probably been about, is it like 10 years old or something? 15, yeah. I mean, I think these stories of marginalized figures like Belle, and just to give some context, so Dido Elizabeth Bell was the daughter of an enslaved woman, Maria Bell, and an aristocratic naval officer whose uncle happened to be Lord Mansfield, who was considered the greatest and most respected jurist of his day in England. And so this was, I believe, it was the 1810s, thereabout. So Dido's mother was, she passed away, and so her father took her to live in England in a manner befitting his rank. So he was an aristocrat, and this was his daughter. And so she went to live in the household of Lord Mansfield. And Lord Mansfield had also taken in another sort of parentless relation who was a kind of second cousin to Dido, and she was white. And her name was Elizabeth, I believe. So they sort of had the same name, which is interesting. But their places within the household were, for all intents and purposes, this was a sort of, they were raised in a kind of egalitarian household. But the way that others would, the way that others would treat them when coming into the household, this was something totally different. So much so that Dido's role in the household began to shift and change, and at times she was invited to take dinner with the family when they had company, but at other times she was left out. And the movie, I think, sort of depicts a lot of this kind of ambiguous place that she held within the family. But I think with such stories, the trick, I think, as you're intimating, is to come at it from the perspective of the marginalized person and to really show everything from that point of view. It's like a question of point of view, which is what we talk a lot about in fiction. Who owns this story is a question you would ask in workshop. And in that case, I think it's so important to tell these marginalized stories, but to tell them through the lens of the marginalized figure, if possible. Hers is a story that I actually mentioned in the Massey lectures, is looking at her life. So I'm delighted that you bring her up. It gives us an opportunity to talk about her. But it's a difficult thing, because I think the danger is, when you're looking at these marginalized figures through a kind of through the eye of somebody who isn't marginalized, it can sort of get back to this sense of objectification and maybe even tokenizing. And and we've been having frequent debates, actually, in literature, whether people who aren't marginalized can tell the stories of people who are marginalized. And everybody, pretty much 99%, has fallen into the camp of no, that this is not something that's okay. But these debates are evolving, in the same ways that our I guess, confrontations with history are always evolving, the way we're telling our stories. And I think that's something that's lovely, because if it's always evolving, then we're changing, we're opening, we're trying to shift our points of view, and it becomes this large conversation that we're sort of having across the ages, and it's some measure, some yardstick of the change, I guess, occurring in our societies. But thank you so much for your question. All right. Okay. Is that time? Okay. Thank you all so much. You're a wonderful audience. I appreciate it. Thank you.